Of course, thank you for inviting me to be part of your national convention. It's such an honor to be here, and I must admit I'm slightly nervous, although I must also admit that on my way here, I was this close to having a nervous breakdown after monitoring the news for the past 48 hours. But let me focus on this presentation because I feel like I'm a fish out of water. This is not my natural habitat. I'm used to talking to students in universities. I'm sometimes on television, but not in front of an audience who I think deserves a greater voice and more seats on the table in nation building. But when Carmi invited me to speak today, I thought the timing could not be better. So yesterday, we commemorated the 3rd year since Typhoon Yolanda left over 6,000 people dead and 4 million families displaced. Okay, apologies for that. I just arrived from Tacloban this morning because over the course of 3 years, I have been working on a research project funded by the Australian Research Council. The project is actually a bit ambitious. My goal is to understand the dynamics of building back better, but not in terms of the physical structures that can make homes and buildings resilient to extreme weather events. I think that is your field of expertise. But my hope is to understand how we can also build our democracy back better in the aftermath of a mega disaster. One of my initial thoughts when I started this project is that I think one of the possible casualties living in times defined by risks, uncertainties, and vulnerabilities is democracy. A lot of sociologists already talked about this, and the message so far has been mixed. Can I have some help, please, with the PowerPoint? Okay. Or can someone just control the PowerPoint and then I'll just say next? Okay, thanks. So a lot of sociologists have already talked about this, and the message has been mixed. Some take a pessimistic view. So if you look at the title of these books, which I've been reading for the past couple of years, they're very threatening, especially the one in the middle, entitled Be Very Afraid. Because we live in uncertain times, and sometimes the way we consume, our patterns of consumption has already taken a toll on the environment, and it savages human dignity. Next slide, please. We also now live in the age of the Anthropocene. This is one of my favorite words at the moment, which basically denotes a new geological epoch following Holocene, where it is now human activities that have made significant global impact on our ecosystem and biodiversity. So you can just imagine how the academia has gone crazy with this new concept. The argument being, in the previous geological epochs, it's not really human beings that have changed the way the planet is configured, but now we live in that era where the entire planet is actually changing because of humans' contribution to how our environment is organized. Next slide, please. So for pessimists, the growing power of hazards are used to justify authoritarian measures and the rollback of democratic rights. So in the field of environmental politics, for example, the scientist on the screen, James Lovelock, has made a case for a more authoritarian world to address climate change. Modern democracies, he said, has led us to a sort of cheeky, egalitarian world where everyone can have their say, to the point that we reach human inertia so huge, in honor of Donald Trump, so huge, you can't really do anything meaningful. So Lovelock instead proposes that we place trust on scientists and other accountable authorities in the same way that people put trust on generals as if we're on war. Next slide, please. Mark Beeson, a colleague from Australia, makes a similar dispiriting argument in favor of good authoritarianism to respond to environmental pressures. So he argues that authoritarian regimes have more power to forbid behavior that destroys the planet. And the policies may not be justified in democratic terms. Maybe we lose some of our freedoms, But this is essential for humanity's survival. So from this perspective, climate change justifies placing security and environmental safety on a higher plane than democratic virtues of freedom and equality on the scale of values. So this slide just goes to show how democracies actually fail us in dealing with climate change. You elect people who tweet like this in office. So in a way, there's this global pattern that shows how democracy can actually fail us in saving the environment and saving the planet. Let's have a more concrete example. Next slide, please. Hurricane Katrina is an oft-cited example where, I'm not sure if you remember, but I remember the footage in the television then, where we see a constant replay of television footage of looters breaking in stores to take food. And it obviously perpetuates a stigma against African American survivors as undeserving of our compassion. So the picture there that says looters will be shot is among the most prominent images of the hurricane, implying the scope of acceptable violence and authoritarian aggression targeted to vulnerable groups. And I think we also saw similar images in the aftermath of Haiyan, or when Typhoon Ruby happened after Typhoon Haiyan. We saw tanks, we saw a lot of military men protecting commercial establishments, the assumption being, after a disaster, there will be looters and they're malicious, without necessarily considering that you have to loot because there's nowhere to pay, right? So, next slide, please. But of course, the example I've been using are examples overseas. So let me talk to you about the case study in Tacloban. So to protect the anonymity of my respondents, I will not disclose the name of the community. I'm not even going to show a photo of it. The picture in front of you is a placeholder. This is actually from Aceh's resettlement site after the tsunami, but it helps to imagine the kind of communities that are rebuilt in disaster-affected areas after a mega disaster. So let's call this Community A. So last year, a big number of families left their homes near the coast of Tacloban because these areas were declared no-build zones, and families were made to move to safer ground. Less than a year since the families moved to their new homes, residents complained of leaking roofs, broken windows, exposed sewage pipes, and hollow walls. As in, pag kinatok mo yung pader, oh my God, wala siyang laman. So obviously, there's a failure on the part of the contractor. Some households already experienced waist-high floods. A number of children already suffer from waterborne diseases. And there have been reports of families abandoning their homes already and relocating back to slums downtown. So obviously, I'm not in the position to judge what exactly happened here, whose responsibility it is. But one of the demands of the People's Organization in Tacloban is to have a full audit of what happened in Yolanda. That's one of their clear demands to President Duterte. What's clear to me, though, is that the residents in this community are suffering, and they need a space to speak out and demand accountability. So of course you ask, all right, so if your houses are substandard, if you don't like your conditions, can't you go to the NHA and demand better conditions? Follow Vince's advice of, being engaged citizens. Can't you complain to the national government, particularly to the NHA about these homes? Well, yes, in principle. Next slide, please. Because in practice, things are a bit different. When I entered this community, the security is so strict. Journalists, community organizers, and researchers like myself who would like to investigate what's going on in this village had to go through a checkpoint and secure the approval of the chief of security. The security guard told me, no cameras, please. The security guard appealed to me because I was being very insistent. Eventually, he let me in, but he just said, you can take pictures, but just one, right? So there's a negotiation there. So when I talked to the respondents, it was evident that they were hesitant to speak up. Some have spoken in cryptic terms during our conversations. One of the mothers I talked to when I asked her about how she likes her new home just basically said, ma'am, ikaw na lang, you be the judge. Just as if she's trying to sense if someone is noticing. And that's a consistent pattern for a lot of the respondents that I talked to there. They were speaking in very cryptic terms. So I find this to be an indication of being hesitant because they're worried that they're under surveillance, that if they say something negative, they may face sanctions. Next slide, please. Two of my respondents affirmed this observation. Again, picture from Aceh. One informant mentioned instances when someone threatened to sequester the homes of those who will grant media interviews to expose the poor conditions of their houses. Families remain available to these threats because they do not hold proof of ownership of these homes. So pwede talaga silang i-threaten na pag magreklamo kayo, tatanggalin kayo dito sa community. Another respondent explained why they are apprehensive to mobilize as a community. Security personnel, one of my respondents explained, are tasked to disperse suspicious gathering, invoking their mandate to maintain peace and order, and recently practice vigilance as part of the state-sponsored campaign against illegal drugs. So when I asked one of my respondents recently, I asked him about, again, the conditions, have the conditions improved? He just said, I just don't want trouble. I just don't want trouble. Let's just leave it there. And then in hushed tones, he said, ma'am, baka ilagay ako sa listahan, wag na lang. So obviously, everyone in this room knows that the list refers to the roster of suspected drug dealers, and the list has become symbolic of threats, such that anyone who has earned the ire of village officials could be part of the list, which could serve as basis for police arrests. So, of course, this is an extreme example. I think this is the worst example of the community I visited in Tacloban. So it leads us to ask the questions. So are the pessimists right? Are the pessimists right to the extent that given the age of mega disasters, we are seeing more trends to more authoritarian forms of governance and restrict the freedoms and liberties of people because really we have no choice. We're at the mercy of the government. Well, not necessarily. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Because they're also optimists. So let's go back to the example of Hurricane Katrina. In the book, Blessed Are the Organized, Jeffrey Stout presents the story of Hurricane Katrina survivors where he found what he calls a motley crew of displaced citizens reconstructing the rudiments of a democratic culture on the fly. One of the many stories in this book is an NGO called Jeremiah, which used the courageous determination of the victims of Hurricane Katrina to reconstitute social relationships in New Orleans as a sort of therapy for their grief. So one of my favorite examples here is leading up to the elections after Hurricane Katrina, they organized a community dialogue with politicians running for office. And what they did was the reverse. Instead of asking politicians to speak, give them their plans, binaliktad nila. They did an accountability session. So what they did was they asked questions and they spoke to the politicians and they demanded a reply. And if the politicians fudged their answers, they turned off the microphone. As in, they literally turned off the microphone. This matters, I think, even if it's a small victory, like in the greater scheme of things, it doesn't really change the political economy of Louisiana. But nevertheless, it shows that communities are capable of organizing even in the aftermath of the disaster. And there are a billion examples I can cite here from all over the world, from Argentina to Aceh to Sri Lanka. But of course, it's always good to go back to the case of Tacloban. Next slide, please. Okay. Again, I'm going to leave out the name of the community to protect the anonymity of my respondents, even though the story I'm about to tell you is the story of one of the more successful communities of building back better. I'm still anonymizing my respondents because I need to honor my word to them when I told them that their identities will be kept secret. So why did I call this a success story of building back better, both in terms of physical structure and also democratic practice? Well, for one thing, the community is an in-city relocation project. Unlike the previous example, like the previous example, the future residents of this community also live in a storm surge-prone area. Hence, they have to transfer to safer ground. So this is already a picture in Tacloban where some areas are declared no-build zones. So this community is considered an in-city relocation because it's 7 kilometers away from the city. It's located in a 12.8 hectare property, 5 kilometers away from downtown. in a consortium of NGOs, foreign donors, and residents themselves are running this project. But more than this, I consider this as a success story because this is one of the very few examples where I found that the plan that the people themselves made was actually implemented, or is actually in the process of being implemented in a way that is consistent to the vision of the people there. When Carmi gave me a briefing about talking here today, she was very particular in asking me the question, why cannot we implement plans? What's wrong with our systems? Obviously, I don't have the answer, but there are lessons that can be learned from this community. And that answer, I argue, has to do with community participation. Of course, community participation is a buzzword. It's a sexy term. I know that in the academe, in humanitarian circles, in NGOs, for you to get a grant, you have to use the word community participation. It can mean many things. It can be instrumentalized, and of course, we also have to reflect with the ways we use the word, sometimes really just to get the grants and get our projects going. And it does sometimes end up meaning nothing. One of the aspects of my projects is to actually map the range of community participation happening in Tacloban. And I started to wonder, kung hakot ka ba sa political rally, political participation na ba yun? Community participation na ba yun? Kung nilagay ka sa service ng isang politiko para pumunta sa press con, para magmukhang maraming supporters yung isang politiko, political participation na ba yun? So of course, it's very elusive, this concept. I guess in your own context, pag nagpa-FGD ka ba, pag nagpa-community consultation ka ba, participation na ba yun? Of course, it's a very elusive concept, but my argument is for community participation to work, a lot of things have to come together, especially in translating vision to practice. Next slide, please. So in this community, so let's go back to the specific examples, there are many manifestations of citizen participation. So I think anyone who's familiar with the Gawad Kalinga model knows the sweat equity model, where homeowners themselves contribute manpower in building the houses. There are lots of similar models around Leyte and Samar, run by different NGOs and charities. And at this point, let me say right away that this community is not a GK community, although there are some similarities, but there are also stark differences. So sweat equity, like people themselves build the houses that they will occupy. So that's one manifestation. Next slide, please. But of course, aside from sweat equity, beneficiaries of the homes are also required to be part of committees, whether it is a procurement committee as in the members of the community, the impoverished people from slum communities are actually the ones being trained to be able to procure the materials that will be used to build the homes. So there's a procurement committee, there's a construction committee, livelihood committee, among others. So this photograph is an example taken from an accounting workshop to train community members. I was sitting in this community workshop on accounting. I've never felt so insecure in my life because I couldn't remember how to classify things, whether a cell phone is an asset or a liability, but it's a good refresher. But this is very much part of the capacity building workshop hosted by the NGOs, but run by the communities themselves. So all committees are encouraged to use their newly acquired skills as part of a long-term strategy of building community-based livelihood programs. So I think if you view it this way, you can imagine that the community participates in every single part of the project cycle. And this is important because you have to have the commitment of the people themselves for the project to work. So from the design of the houses, and they solicited help from Tampei, the architects who are doing participatory design. They selected whether they have row houses or 2 floors or duplex. The community themselves even chose the color of the paint or how the clusters of the houses will be called. So every step of the way, the community is part of it, even the future when they move there. So they've decided that the supplies they use to build the houses will be used as a livelihood project in the future. So in the future, this community can actually build hollow blocks because they bought the equipment and they know how to make their own hollow blocks. So I think that is one of the key messages. Participation here is not token, it is substantive, it is engaged. But there's a big caveat, it's very, very slow, right? So that's the trade-off. Next slide, please. Participation is also manifest with the way the community conducts decision-making. So for example, in a top-level meeting among project leaders, it is noticeable that there's a culture that actively gives voices to everyone in the table. So when I sit in these meetings, it is obvious that men tend to speak more than women, but you have a facilitator there who makes sure that everyone's voices can get heard. And when there are tense issues, it's very interesting that the first response, when there are tense issues, the first response is, we have to ask the community. So when they debate, ilang oras ba yung dapat ibigay ng bawat pamilya para gumawa ng bahay? Default answer, we have to ask the community. We can't decide that as the project team. So I'm very impressed with these communities because they are empowered in the sense that they know when problems should be solved within their community and when they need to be addressed by government. They know when to engage in dialogue with DPWH in terms of road construction, and they also know when they need to engage LUA, the Local Water Utilities Administration. They're also starting to be very politicized. So some of them are my Facebook friends. And when Typhoon Haiyan happened and China gave a certain amount of money, one of my respondents put as a Facebook status message, "Ha, yan lang ibibigay ng China. Eh kami nga 550 homes, mas mahal pa yung budget namin dyan eh." So there's some critical thinking happening as well, projecting the local politics to national politics in terms of demanding. Magkano ba ang ilang bilyong piso, di ba? Ano bang kaya niyang gawin? And they have a sense that budget matters, na hindi lang pwedeng wish list yan, that there are trade-offs, that there are budget issues that they have to consider. So yesterday, I spent the 3rd commemoration of Haiyan with some of the community leaders. We were in a mass grave in Barangay Basper, listening to President Duterte not only talk about Leni Robredo's legs, but threaten Michael Dino, assistant president, who he calls the assistant president in the Visayas. Maybe it was a joke, I'm hoping it is a joke, but he was threatening Michael Dino to say, "Tang ina, pag hindi yan natapos in 1 month, ha, lagot ka sa akin, papatayin kita," or something to that effect. Why is this fascinating? It's fascinating because, just building on what Vince said, sometimes it's so alluring to hear someone tell someone, you gotta do your job, right? It's so enticing. But I think if we want to do things correctly, things don't necessarily have to be fast for them to be right. Especially if you want the communities to be part of the process every single way. I support President Duterte when he says, tanggalin yung red tape sa titulo ng lupa. Tanggalin yung red tape sa bureaucracy. Ano bang problema NHA? Ano bang problema LUA? Bakit ang bagal nung paghanap ng mga dokumento? I think that's fantastic. That's perfect, actually. And if anything, the best indicator of the success of this government is not whether we get our passports in a week or get the driver's license in an hour, but really how fast it serves the most vulnerable people in the community. So kung kayang mapabilis ni President Duterte at ng buong burokrasya, yung proseso ng pagre-relocate at pagbibigay ng mga title at paglilay ng mga pipes, that's fantastic. But that doesn't mean that we have to just rely on government for things to happen, for plans to happen. Why? Because it can be arbitrary. Just one person can make the plans. And I think what's fantastic about this community is that it's the responsibility of many people to make this work. Okay, of course, I'm not naive when it comes to this. Next slide, please. There are, of course, some problems. This is obviously a picture from the community. Obviously, I'm the person on the right, but I just blurred the images of my respondents. Of course, there are issues. Meeting fatigue is one of these. The woman I'm talking to in this picture cannot join the community dialogues because she has to take care of 8 of her children. I raise these issues not to understand or not to undermine the community's achievements, but to surface the complexity of this modality of community participation. That yes, people have to work. Yes, not everyone can build their own homes. Community participation has its costs. Next slide, please. But unfortunately, for democracies to work, it entails a series of endless meetings. And meetings are tiring, and they cause tensions. But I think these forums are also create habits for democratic practice that we need in the most trying of this time. And I think this is important because we not only secure accountability between the people in the government, but it creates habits for community members to look at each other as fellow citizens who owe each other an accountability, who are responsible for each other. So I think this is one of the reasons why this community is a success story, why the plan, the vision, is translated into practice, because everyone is monitoring what's going on, because everyone has a voice, or maybe not everyone, but majority have a voice. And I think this reflects on the broader reasons why the recovery process in Tacloban has been decried by a lot of the communities because there is a lack of consultation about mega projects. They decry the forcible relocation of communities to what they call death zones. So when communities were made to leave damaged zones, they were instead asked to move to a death zone. A death zone as an area with no water, electricity, and no livelihood, right? So would you prefer danger or death? That's very challenging. So let me now wrap up. So far, I have put forward the views of pessimists and guarded optimists about the projects of citizen participation in a time defined by risks and uncertainty. I thought of putting forward a third example as case study, but I've decided to focus on these two for now. But if you are a visual person like myself, these are two ends of the gradient, the authoritarian case study and the hyper-participatory practice. There are lots of models in between, and that's what the project is about, to map the modality of the gradient or the range of citizen participation in Tacloban. All right, so what do we do with these stories? How do we bring these two together? There's a lot to say here, but the quote from one of my favorite sociologists comes to mind. Next slide, please. We need the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will. And to quote Mike Hume, and here I'm quoting extensively, lest be accused of plagiarism, pessimism of the intellect does not mean we always look for the worst case scenario, as many tend to do today. It means seeing the world as it is, rather than others would like it to be or as others fantasize. Pessimism of the intellect means that we do not have to accept unquestioningly any of the doom-mongering scares about how we are all at imminent risk of destruction from climate or indeed drugs and crime. It means accepting nothing at face value and doubting all that we are told. But the pessimism of the intellect, next slide please, needs to be underpinned by the optimism of the will. That means having belief in the human capacity to meet new challenges, overcome them, and move the society forward. And I think it's the optimism of the will that is in short supply today. Many of us have lost in humanity's capacity to change the way the world works. But I think now, more than ever, we see politics as the art of the possible. It is not the time to say, I'll just do the best I can in my work and see if it impacts the broader society. We need to be more deliberate in our efforts, not just to engage government, but bring the voices in the margins. So I think every time I'm invited to a forum like this, and people ask me, how do I make decisions in relation to my job? How is your talk relevant to my job? I always make an appeal that whenever we make important decisions, I hope one of the questions we always ask is, where are the voices from the margins? How are they affected and how are they relevant in my decision making? Last slide, please. Our democracy is only as good as our weakest link. And I invite you to join the conversation on how, in our work, we can be citizens who can expand the space for democratic practice, bring in more voices, no matter how tedious, and be agents of both skepticism and optimism. So I will conclude my comments here, and I very much look forward to our conversation.